I think more people will trickle in later, but let's just start now because why not? At least we'll get the part where I'm talking out of the way. Okay, so hi, my name's Dustin Atlas. For those who don't know me, how dare you not know me? And I'm the director of Jewish Studies at Queen's University. Um, Today we're going to have an open discussion of Martin Shuster's How to Measure a World, a book that's had the misfortune to come out mid-COVID and so hasn't received the attention it deserves. We're going to help rectify that now. I'm not going to waste much time talking, but in a properly philosophical fashion, we'll begin with the responses, then Martin will respond to the responses and then open it up and anyone can respond to the responses and or just say stuff about the book. And if anyone has any ideas or thoughts, which they absolutely must get out, you can enter them in chat throughout. Our first speaker is Dr. Michael Morgan. He's the Chancellor's Professor of Philosophy and Jewish Studies Emeritus, a word I've only seen in print, I've never pronounced, so now I probably embarrassed myself. Emeritus, great, emeritus. And I've made a fool of myself once. I'm aiming for 3 per talk. He's written a bunch of books, including Fackenheim's Jewish Philosophy, Platonic Piety, Beyond Auschwitz, Interim Judaism, Discovering Levinas, and a number of articles so voluminous I'm not actually going to bother trying to list them. So let's just begin here. I will absent myself and return when you're done.
Dustin, thanks very much. And let me thank everyone for organizing this event and thank Martin for a really engaging and an interesting book. I'm going to speak from notes. I'll try to keep an eye on the clock so that I won't overstay my welcome, so to speak. In reading the book, for those of you who have, you're aware of how intriguing and provocative a book it is, and how filled it is with all kinds of detailed analysis of ideas and figures. What I'm going to try to do is take to change the metaphor, a feather from Martin's cap, so to speak, along the way, in order to keep the reader, I think, on track. He uses an expression that I became quite fond of when he employed it. He would use the expression, well, if we take a high altitude view of things at a certain stage, we'll get a sense of the lay of the land. And in those places, he frequently will give us a sketch of where we are. I tend to prefer stepping back, but that's okay. He obviously likes stepping up. It still means some distance in order to get a sense for the overall structure of the project. So what I'm going to do is say a bit about the overall structure of the project and the book, and read a few passages from it, and then raise a question at the end that arises, I think, in virtue of the large structure and frame of the book. Martin proposes to defend, or better really defend and articulate, a conception of Judaism that he derives from a remark that Emmanuel Levinas makes in a paper from 1969 called Judaism and the Present. And the remark has to do with Judaism being an anachronism. And what I'm going to do is, I want to say, I'll read a passage and then say a word or two about what that might mean, and then move along to identify what Martin does with that proposal and what he thinks the challenge that faces him is. So let me begin with a passage from very late in the book, on page 206. Martin says, Levinas's suggestion is the idea that the historical standing of Judaism amid world history somehow testifies to a fundamental anachronism toward that history and that world. This point about a relationship to the world is the tenor in which Levinas's remark that Jews are a people who doubt themselves, who in a certain sense belong to a religion of unbelievers, ought to be understood. Such an anachronism is available, indeed likely experienced at some point, by everyone, but it is not equally or at all times prioritized or recognized by all traditions or all segments of human cultural expression, including historical expressions of Judaism itself. Nonetheless, the possibility of a gap between self and world, anachronism, is central to human ethical accomplishment. And then he goes on. Now, I take it that this is might very well be a strange expression to use to characterize Judaism, strange to the ears of many. But if we take a look at it, there is certainly a meaning that it might have at a superficial or a surface level that is not the one that Martin is prioritizing. That is, one might think that Judaism is somehow out of sync with the time in which it occurs, insofar as Judaism is devoted so heavily toward memory and nostalgia on the one hand, and hope and a kind of eagerness about the possibilities of the future on the other. So one might think that Judaism is an anachronism insofar as that rather than emphasize the present, it emphasizes the past and the future. A somewhat deeper account, however, might suggest that Judaism is never, as it were, does not treat itself to be limited by the present, that it's a way of life that is somehow driven by the distinction between what is the case and what might be the case, what has been the case and what is on the one hand, what might be and what could be on the other. So that's a somewhat deeper understanding of what it means, what it might mean to call Judaism anachronistic. Levinas, however, in the paper, suggests something a little bit deeper still, and that is that Judaism is somehow oblique to the temporal flow insofar as it anticipates, it engages in a concrete fulfillment of the primordial anachronism of the human. Now, at this point, we're in very deep Levinasian terminological ground, so to speak. What Levinas is suggesting, I think, by the term anachronism in this particular formulation, is more in tune with what he calls in the late 60s and afterwards diachrony, a term that he uses to point to the centrality and priority of the face-to-face in our experience. And that is the infinite responsibility that each of us has to every other person. And in this phrase, when he refers to Judaism as somehow invested in being the concrete fulfillment of this primordial anachronism, he means that the infinite responsibility that arises from the point of view of a person toward every other person in the second person is nothing that ever occurs in the present. It always has been the case. It occurs in as he puts it, an immemorial past. And so on this reading of Judaism as anachronism, Judaism is a kind of implementation of the orientation given to all human beings by their interpersonal relations with others and the demands and claims that makes on all of us. Now, I think Martin is primarily in this book concerned with the second interpretation that I gave. That is, he's concerned with the sense in which anachronism is a feature of a Judaism that conceives of the difference between what the world ought to be like, could be like, and perhaps ought to be like, and not just is. And his project in the book, and now I move to my second point, as it were, is to articulate a kind of transcendental argument for conditions for the possibility of such a way of life, such a way of acting toward history and toward the world. That is, Martin's invested in the question, what must the human condition be like in order for Judaism to be this way, to be a way of life articulated around the distinction between the way the world is and what it could be. And the answer that he gives has different stages, but one might encapsulate the answer in the following way. One might say that for Martin, I'm putting it in my terms, I agree with so much of what he's had to say. It's easier for me to use terms that I would use rather than in his own. I would say that the answer for this account of the human condition that makes possible this view of Judaism as anachronism is what one might call intersubjective situated agency. That is, that human beings are what they are insofar as they are embedded in and engaged with a world and with other persons in that world. Now, Martin says as much on page 21. I won't read the passage. He puts it in his terms, but I've just put it in mine, and that's probably sufficient. This kind of account, by the way, reminds me of a couple of other figures whom he doesn't mention in the book, who articulate this same broad conception. Of course, I mean, it's broadly a conception that comes out of a number of the figures that he does mention, Heidegger and others as well. But I think Charles Taylor, for example, articulates this very well. He has a paper on embeddedness, human being as existence as embeddedness in a situation and in the world, in Wittgenstein and Heidegger. And it's also a view that I find in Emil Fackenheim's work. Fackenheim articulates this view best in Metaphysics and Historicity in 1961, but then employs it throughout his early post-Holocaust work, and therefore God's Presence in History at the end of the 60s, 1970. And then it's re-articulated and reformulated somewhat in the kind of hermeneutical account of human existence he appropriates and modifies from Gadamer in To Mend the World. So I think that this is a view that others have held, and many others indeed, and it's one that I would certainly endorse. Now, in order to work out the details for this, Martin elaborately and beautifully really helps us to all kinds of interesting themes and passages and texts from figures as diverse as Maimonides, the Rambam, Aristotle, Heidegger, Adorno, Benjamin, Stanley Cavell, Levinas, Davidson, and then there are others who come up on the footnotes and such. Now, given this picture, Martin then proposes Judaism as a form that the kind of tension between the is and the ought, between the self and world, might take. And he then provides an articulation of at least two particular ways in which this practical engagement with the world and with others might take shape. So in the course of his account, he identifies these two ways, which he associates particularly with Maimonides and Adorno, as these two practical stances or modes of engagement with the world and others. The first he refers to as ethical critique or moral outrage. It's the orientation that he derives from his reading of Adorno. And to me, it's a kind of very reminiscent of Fackenheim's argument for the ontological character of resistance, the long argument in the digression into men the world. And then secondly, what he calls on different occasions, he gives it different expressions. It's the modality of engagement that he derives from Maimonides. He refers to it as inquisitive awe, awed wonder, and also an exploration and investigation of the world's wonders. So it's a project oriented in particular around trying to understand better and better the world that, of course, we interpret as well as live in. Now, this is the broad picture that one gets from Martin's project and from the book. And it's a project that leads me to ask what to me is the question that lingers, and it's a question to which he makes some suggestive comments toward answering, but I'm not sure that he answers explicitly. It has to do with the fact that the modes of engagement, particularly the two that he articulates, are normative modes. They both have a normative character. And so I'm led to ask questions about that normative character. First, what grounds it? Secondly, if it takes a certain form or forms, subsidiary just to moral outrage and inquisitive awe, but much more detailed, substantial articulation. What's the relationship between the ground of the normativity and the various articulations of substantive norms and directions? And therefore, ultimately, what should we do and how should we live in such a situation? Now, I think Martin gives us makes some suggestions in the direction of answering this. And I'm going to conclude by reading a passage where I think that he does point in the direction of an answer that might make the book seem a bit more Jewish in some ways than it currently does. And this is, there are a couple of different passages, but the one that I'd like to look at or read very quickly, and then I'll conclude with this, is on page 200 and 201, after he's finished talking about Cavell, and now Cavell and Levinas on skepticism. He says the following. He's really picking up on the distinction between the face-to-face and infinite responsibility as a kind of having an ethical primacy, and a primacy even to consciousness and cognition and thought and articulation. And he, referring to a passage from Edith Bishograd, he says, one commentator puts it well when she notes that the idea of the infinite becomes a barrier and checkpoint for consciousness, which cannot be evaded. Cavell captures a related point with a suggestion that the philosophical problem of the other, which is ambiguous between the one that Cavell takes to be the real problem of the other, how to live with the other, or the problem of other minds, how to know the other, is the trace or scar of the departure of God. Cavell does not here mean departure in literal terms, Martin says, as if God or the infinite were a being that simply departed, but rather in conceptual and practical terms. It just is the case that once we begin talking about the infinite, then it has vanished. For this reason, Levinas frequently deploys the notion of a trace. I'm not sure that it's for this reason, but Levinas certainly does deploy the notion of a trace, capturing with that term the idea that with our encounter with the other, there is in a deep sense nothing there to capture, for it's what makes encounter indeed anything, that is the kind of engagements that he's been discussing, possible in the first place. In this way, the encounter with the other, even as it underwrites the existence of a world, also already points beyond that world, making plausible the sort of apophasis that both Maimonides and Adorno instantiate in different ways. And the question that I ask is this beyond intended to be a beyond like Levinas's beyond? Is it meant to be a beyond like Maimonides' beyond? Adorno's beyond being a different kind of beyond altogether. And is this beyond the ground of the normativity or something else? I'll conclude with that.
Right, thank you very much for that. Moving on, sorry, my order's been reversed. Professor Annabel Herzog is the professor of political theology and the head of the cultural studies program at the School of Political Science at the University of Haifa. Her last book, Levinas's Politics, Justice, Mercy, Universality, won the 2021 Jordan Schnitzer Award in Philosophy and Jewish Thought, and she is here to talk about the book and unfortunately not, attack and humiliate Martin the way I would like one of us to.
Thank you very much, Dustin. I hope that we're getting to the end of that pandemic and back to meeting in 3 dimensions. But after more than 2 years of Zoom meetings, the advantages of such encounters, which allow us to be far and near at the same time, are very clear. And in this particular circumstance, we can enjoy discussing Martin's extraordinary book while not moving away from our bedrooms or offices. How to Measure a World is an extraordinary book for many reasons. One of them is that it is both a piece of scholarship and a piece of original philosophy. It's very seldom that we find such a double achievement in the same book. Martin's book offers detailed analysis of some of the arguments of several important philosophers, Maimonides, Adorno, Benjamin, Levinas, and Cavell. But in so doing, it proposes or even creates a new philosophy, a new look at the world. It is this new look at the world that Martin calls a philosophy of Judaism. To be clear, that philosophy of Judaism has nothing to do with the Jewish religion as a sum of laws and practices, or even as a collection of moral injunctions and words of wisdom. That philosophy of Judaism is not grounded in Jewish texts, by which I mean the canonic elements of the Jewish library, the Jewish Bible, the Talmud, the commentaries, the Zohar, etc. It does not belong to Jewish philosophy in its usual sense, namely the endeavor to establish connections between universal reason and the particular tradition that constitutes Judaism. According to that definition of Jewish philosophy, indeed, Jewish philosophers are philosophers first, but philosophers who are mindful of their Jewish identity or faith and who seek to express those in their philosophies. Jewish philosophy, therefore, usually includes a philosophical commitment and the Jewish consciousness. Here, however, we are not talking about such a Jewish philosophy, but about a philosophy of Judaism. We're talking about a conception of Judaism, an idea of Judaism, which is neither religious, nor cultural, nor political, nor ethnic, and nor even purely ethical, but philosophical. And in this, Martin's book is provocative. It develops a thinking based on new arguments and a new intellectual narrative. It makes us not only examine, discuss, and compare the philosophical positions of the authors that it analyzes, but it makes us think about the meaning of Judaism as a philosophical concept. In that context, Martin chooses to focus on 5 philosophers who were never put together before that book. The 5 of them were Jewish or regarded as connected to the Jewish people. We know that Adorno was not Jewish according to Orthodox definitions, and probably according to himself, despite being labeled as a Jew by the Nazis. The explicit purpose beyond this unexpected grouping is, says Martin, to create a new tradition, not only of Judaism, but also of philosophy, namely a new philosophical concept of Judaism. Therefore, although Martin did not use this term and probably will not like it, I would say that the book results from a kind of deconstruction of these 5 authors taken together, a deconstructive process that, by putting them unexpectedly side by side, extracts from their thinking philosophical presuppositions and meanings that were not visible or not clearly visible beforehand. It is this deconstructive gesture that revealed the connection between Maimonides' phenomenological claims and related claims in Adorno, Benjamin, Levinas, and Cavell. It is this deconstructive gesture that allows formulating the statement that Judaism is an anachronism, and that this anachronism manifests itself in the tension between 2 moods of being in the world, that of awed wonder and that of moral outrage. This tension, by the way, reminds me of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is not mentioned in the book, but could have, and maybe should have. As mentioned in Martin's book, anachronism appears here in its Levinasian sense. In Levinas's text, quoted at the beginning of the book, Judaism in the Present, Levinas discusses the modern challenges with which the French Jews of his generation were confronted. This essay, first published in 1960, belongs to a series of polemical articles in which Levinas redefines Judaism and its message for a community of French Jews decimated by the Holocaust and then rebuilt by North African Jewry. In that article, Levinas uses the term anachronism to describe the gap between the modern existence of the Jewish people and the ahistorical eternal message of Judaism. He insists that Judaism is, quote, an essential content which history cannot touch, end of quote, but which touches and transforms history. Indeed, the message of Judaism, namely, quote, the ideal of earthly justice, has a function in the economy of being. Levinas writes, quote, in the world that has become historical, shouldn't a person be as old as the world? Deprived of any fixed point, the modern world feels frustrated. It used to invoke reason in order to have justice, but justice needs a stable base, an interiority, someone on which to rest. Someone, a person, is indispensable to justice before being indispensable to itself. Eternity is necessary to a person, end of quote. In other words, the abstract eternity of the Jewish message and the concreteness of specific persons need each other. The universal principle of justice needs real people to be implemented. The message of Judaism is at the core of any attempt to realize justice in the historical world. It's not restricted to a particular nation or religion, but it manifests itself in every attempt to achieve justice. Therefore, the anachronism does not only consist in the gap between the historical existence of the Jewish people and its eternal message, it also consists in the gap between the historical existence of all humans and their quest for justice. In the book, Martin focuses on that Levinasian idea that Judaism has a function in the economy of being, or that, to quote Martin, there is some basic elements about human beings, an element that equally may be termed Judaism or anachronism or monotheism, that is somehow essential to human experience, being the way that it is, end of quote. Then, however, Martin makes a subtle shift from Levinas's definitions to his own, when he argues that the chief concern of his investigation of anachronism is the possibility of human freedom. Here, therefore, at the very beginning of the book, Martin shows that he will use specific works of philosophy, for instance, Levinas's philosophy, to create his own, in moving the focus of the inquiry from the concern from justice, expressed in Levinas, to the concern from freedom, expressed in how to measure a world. Therefore, the book focuses on what it means to be a free human being from the point of view of the anachronism first defined by Levinas, but hereafter used by Martin in his own manner. I said earlier that anachronism is in effect a gap. Martin calls it a dissonance between self and world. Indeed, the dissonance between signification and empirical existence is that of our condition in the world, our feeling of self in the world. Here, I must say, I cannot avoid thinking of another thinker, which is briefly mentioned in the book, but not as one of its protagonists, Albert Camus, who developed the notion of dissonance in the world, of not feeling completely at home in the world to the extreme via the concept of absurd. Camus was not Jewish, but his conception of the absurd, elaborated in his readings of Kafka, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Shuster, all read in depth by Levinas, has something, not everything, but something in common with Levinas's concept of anachronism. In addition, very close to the arguments of Martin's book is Camus' understanding of the relationship between human freedom and ethics. The book, however, is not about Camus. And in fact, it's not about Levinas either. In its 4 chapters, via his examination of 5 philosophers, How to Measure a World tells a story of our dissonant relation to the world. This narrative starts with 2 basic feelings, that of awe and that of moral outrage. It then continues in describing the relationship between these feelings and history and language. This story constitutes Martin's Phenomenology. And when I say Martin, I mean Martin Shuster, not Martin Heidegger. Of course, I do not mention Heidegger here only as a joke. In the chapter on Maimonides, Martin argues that Maimonides relies on a phenomenological method. And by this, he means in a very Heideggerian manner that underlying all Maimonidean arguments is the question of the possibility of there being anything at all. According to Martin Shuster, not Heidegger, the ontological question underlines the entirety of Maimonides' enterprise. The question of the possibility of there being anything at all, however, is not that of the existence of different objects in the world, but that of the emergence of a world, namely of an infinite web of relationships between objects, judgments, meanings, conceptual connections, etc. Put differently, the philosophical insights about God or anything else emerge as the result of a certainty, quote, originating from how the subjective and objective elements of experience hang together, end of quote. A certainty that leads to, or better, that composes our feeling of awe. Since, however, only Moses, according to Maimonides, was able to grasp the world's entire interconnectedness, what is left to us, Jews and non-Jews alike, is to endeavor to deepen our own certainty and feeling of awe, while calmly knowing and experiencing our limits and our alienation to the world. This process is what Martin called anachronism and what Camus again called the absurd. I do not forget that a big difference among many between Maimonides and Camus is that Camus was not calm at all about the dissonance he saw between the world and our grasp of it. If Maimonides is calm, however, Martin is not, like Camus. In the 2nd chapter of How to Measure a World, he says that the Maimonidean mood is not enough. It neglects something that is irreducible to the feeling of awe, namely the feeling of moral outrage, of anger at the suffering that exists in the world. Martin here focuses on Adorno to illustrate his case and emphasize that Maimonidean wisdom clashes with indignation and resistance. Taking Martin's narrative seriously, we must conclude that not only can the Maimonidean awe be opposed by ethical indignation and resistance, but that it must be. Indeed, there is too much suffering to calmly accept our limited condition. Martin explains that the calamities of the modern world, be they Auschwitz or the sufferings brought about by capitalism, prohibit, quote, the construction of any overarching moral meaning or justification for the social or historical whole. Therefore, concludes Martin, quote, where for Maimonides, the world was such that it could invite and sustain wonder and inquiry, for Adorno, the world is such that it can sustain ethical indignation and commitment, end of quote. At that point, the book presents the 2 perspectives as 2 alternatives separated from each other. The last chapters on history and language, however, show their interconnectedness. The question then asked is whether awe and outrage depend on historical context, and if so, how to understand the impact of history on the relationship between the world and the human attunement to the world. The accent here is on how to understand, namely on the different conceptions of history. From Martin's analysis of Adorno and Benjamin's conception of dialectical history, I would like to emphasize particularly Benjamin's accent on the neglected components of history, on the losers, the discarded and lost, the immaterial details, the avoided stories. Benjamin's huge and unfinished Arcades project is an attempt at building history from the perspective of suffering and, as Adorno also said, of catastrophes. Martin here emphasizes the deeply ethical and socio-political components of such a vision of history, an ethical and socio-political component that appears in discourse as well. To analyze the role of discourse in our relationship to the world, Martin turns to Cavell and again to Levinas. In that chapter, Martin objects to any philosophy that would start with the subject's inner life, building objectivity and intersubjectivity on such a priori subjectivity. What must be also rejected is the notion of a universal reason already there, waiting to be discovered. Reason, says Martin, is a sort of conversation. It constitutes itself through language, namely through relationships. Therefore, the very possibility to give meanings to the world and to our presence as part of the world takes place in our relationship to others, manifested in language. More language is not a way to give meaning to a word that would already be there. It's a way to create meaning and hence to create together with others a world in which the feeling of awe and of ethical critique coexist. I would like to conclude with a question related to the entire project of the book as it is summed up and wrapped up in its conclusion. It's a question that I often ask myself in relation to Levinas, but also to my own behavior in the world. If indeed Martin's reformulation of Levinas's concept of anachronism and his universalization of Levinas's own universalization of Judaism decolonize not only Levinas's story, but Judaism itself, why do we need Judaism to start with? In the last sentences of the book, Martin quotes Levinas saying that, quote, there is not a single thing in a great spirituality that would be absent from another great spirituality, end of quote. Thus, what is the status of the particularity of this or that great spirituality? Do we need such a particularity as a phenomenal substrate to start with? Martin does not seem to think so, since he suggests that Judaism and Jewish history are not essentially diasporist, nor essentially Zionist, nor essentially anything at all, except the expression of anachronism. But if so, why use the term Judaism at all? Why do we need traditions at all? Why choose to decolonize a concrete culture with its chauvinism and violence, rather than start from the very beginning with universal freedom? Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. I guess you said no, thank you. Okay, our last speaker is Dr. Achtenberg, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, the University of Nevada. She's the author of Cognition of Value in Aristotle's Ethics, Essential Vulnerabilities, and a host of valuable articles, or at least articles that have been valuable to me, and is currently working on Lev Shestov and Emmanuel Levinas, The Soul in Plato's Republic, and Levinas's response to Sartre's Portrait of the Jew. And now we're going to hear her response to Martin.
Thank you, Dustin, and welcome everyone to my home in Reno. I was thinking of that because this is the second time I've welcomed Martin to my home in Reno, because he came here for the Levinas research seminar and delivered a paper that I guess partly constitutes this book. So good to have you again, Martin. Martin Shuster's How to Measure a World is an exciting construction of a contemporary Jewish philosophy in which we, through awed wonder or moral outrage at a world in all its details, take the measure of that world, that is, constantly reorient ourselves toward the world, and relate to others through language understood not to function between already constituted selves that connect through it, but between selves mutually constituted by language itself. His touchstones for such a philosophy are Maimonides for awed wonder, leading to awareness of God's existence outside it, Adorno and Benjamin for moral outrage, Levinas and Cavell for a fundamentally intersocial language, and Levinas for the idea that motivates the book, Judaism as anachronism. For Shuster's Judaism, we are socially and linguistically constituted language users who, through being attentive and deeply connected to a world, experience a deep rift with that world and are fundamentally outside of it, outside of our time and not at home in our place. The world we are in here and now need not be and points to a beyond. It is an appealing philosophy Martin constructs, starting from the fact that he actually does construct a Jewish philosophy for our time, passing to the enormous amount of interpretive work he does to marshal or oppose philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Heidegger, Arendt, Lukács, and others, as well as the ones he takes as his touchstones. And ending with the fact that the philosophy constructed rouses us to look beyond our time, inspired by or on behalf of others. I will comment on Martin's work by following his lead and using certain philosophers and thinkers as touchstones that support Martin's constructed philosophy, amplify it, illuminate it through comparison, and cause us to think about different directions he might have taken. So I've numbered the parts. Number one. Here are two pairs of contrasting midrashim on the first part of the first line of the Joseph story. And Jacob settled in the land of his father's sojournings. So I'm going to give you two pair of contrasting midrash. And Jacob settled. Then Jacob dwelt safely and in peace in the land of his possession, and in the land of his birth, and in the land of the sojournings of his father. As it is said, and Jacob dwelt in the land of his father's sojournings. And here's the contrast. And Jacob settled. Rabbi Yochanan said, wherever it writes, and he settled, it denotes trouble. And thus, and Israel settled in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And I'll give you the second pair. And Jacob settled. He who lives in the Eretz Yisrael accepts the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, while he who dwells outside is as though he worshipped idols. And here's the contrast. His father's sojournings. This is characteristic of the righteous. The Holy One, blessed is he, confers greatness on them, but they humble themselves. For example, he made Abraham great, yet Abraham described himself to the children of Heth as a stranger and a sojourner. For in this world, the righteous dwell as strangers. Martin's philosophy of Judaism is like the midrashic view that is conveyed by including both of the contrasting statements in each pair in midrash, not just one of the two. The one for which the good situation is when we are settled, and the one that declares trouble begins when we settle. The one that says we must be in a certain place to be righteous, and the one that says the righteous instead are strangers to and mere sojourners in a place. Martin says the Judaism that, like Midrash, includes both. The two for him are being in a world and also always directing ourselves beyond it. 2. I collected these midrashim for an essay in which I argue that Jacques Derrida figures himself as both Elijah, the foe of idolatry, and Moses, who did not enter and did not circumcise his sons. Circumcision, Derrida says, that's all I've ever talked about. Of course, it's not all he ever talked about, so he means that circumcision figures the problematic he has always talked about, namely that incision is excision, that the word milah that includes you in a group is a cut milah that excludes what is outside the group, even though what is outside is part of what makes the group or you what you are. Like Derrida, it seems to me, Martin is saying that he, in doing Cavell, Adorno, and Levinas, and the others, has been doing Jewish philosophy all along, a philosophy of human beings who are what they are by being in a world of interconnected beings, but also by letting that world keep them attuned to what is beyond that world and makes it, or what it, and makes it what it is, or could make it better than it is. Number 3. This leads me to wonder if Derrida would be a good touchstone for Martin's Jewish philosophy, given that they both feature a paradoxical in the world, beyond the world, inside, outside approach. Perhaps not, though, since Martin seems to emphasize not being at home. He quotes Adorno saying, "Today it is part of morality not to be at home." Derrida, to the contrary, is more paradoxical, saying that home is the condition for being outside it, that hospitality requires a home. That is, that there's no giving without having your own substance from which to give. I'm not sure about the emphasis, and I'm interested in hearing what Martin has to say. You talk about being in a world and about being beyond it, but is the emphasis on the latter, on the God who created us and on the better world we could build? And if so, is that better than the more intertwined or paradoxical approach, and why? Number 4, in The Meaning of Religious Practice, 1937, Levinas makes marveling or marvelment, émerveillement, the basis of Judaism. Martin does something like this as well, through a consideration of Maimonides, for whom, on Martin's account, the proof of God's existence comes not by arguing that where there is order, there is a source, but from being embedded in and practically experiencing the details of a world whose elements hang together and make each other intelligible and possible. Quoting Martin, "We might say that through an acknowledgement of the complex and amazing ways in which the elements of this world hang together, we are practically led to an acknowledgement, made certain of the light that makes this world possible." Interestingly, Levinas's marvelment is different than Martin's amazement. Levinas's is at the very existence of things, not at their nature. He says, the belief in creation, the basis of Judaism, is nothing other than this marvelment, émerveillement. Specifically, marvelment at the simple fact that things are. Quote, "To the Jew, the existence of things is something infinitely surprising," and quote, "strikes him as a miracle." Quote, "He experiences marvelment at every instant at the fact that the world is there." This contrast highlights and shows what is important in Martin's position, namely that he draws from Maimonides a position of awed wonder at the world based on what it is, namely a world of wondrously interconnected beings that show up for us in our dealings with them. Number 5. Levinas's thinking on marvelment, like Martin's on amazement, is connected to his thoughts on Maimonides in a piece from the same period as the one I mentioned before, the piece L'Actualité de Maimonides, 1935. Levinas takes the essential in Maimonides' work to be the distinction he draws between what is true in the created world, in which future is integrated into present, since the future is realization of present potential, and the creation itself. God is not a maker who uses matter that has potential for future fulfillment, quoting Levinas. The worker has need of material, but God is not a worker. He is a creator. For Levinas, Maimonides' creation is about the upsurge of the new, and wonder is at that, not at the mutual facilitation of beings. In Jerusalem and Athens, Leo Strauss distinguishes between a philosophy that begins in wonder and a Judaism that begins in something more like awe, or if we were to use Levinas's term, marvelment, quoting Strauss here. According to the Bible, the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. According to the Greek philosophers, the beginning of wisdom is wonder. Once again, the contrast highlights the difference and significance of Martin's position that our wonder at the world and its interconnections themselves can orient us to what is outside of and cause of that world. Number 6. In The Meaning of Religious Practice, Levinas claims that religious practice disrupts and suspends our usual way of relating to things as objects there for our use, so that we instead marvel at them. The idea that religious practice suspends or troubles, interrupts, marks a pause, is one of his earliest efforts directed towards delineating the anachronic relationship which constitutes the ethical, that in his later work is described as welcoming the other, being poured out by the other, substituting for the other, and various other terms. The other on that account disrupts us, and instead of assuming the other to ourselves, we welcome him or her. The other on that account pours us out and is in us. This leads me to a point about Martin's work in which moral outrage takes us out of the present world, anachrony, and separately self is co-constituted by others through language. For Adorno, Martin says, quote, "The world cannot sustain awe or wonder, but instead proposes moral indignation or resistance. It is a cruel and inhospitable world of useless or needless suffering. In addition, the world is a world of meaning in which my subjectivity is never the sole arbiter of things, or even the source of meaning, but instead meaning itself are intersubjective achievements. It is the world intersubjectively understood as cruel and inhospitable, and not as a capitalist paradise, that calls on us for anachrony of a certain type, namely, resistance to the present. I want to highlight Martin's point by contrasting it to Levinas's, in which it is my relation to the other itself that is anachronistic, the other that is absolute upsurge or absolute singularity, and as such cannot be grasped over time. And this relation to the other as absolute upsurge or singularity itself both makes knowledge possible and constitutes ethics. I would add a little point of critique, namely that it seems to me Martin sometimes confuses the indefinite and the infinite in Levinas. As for example, when he derives the idea of anachrony from Adorno's idea that there is a, quote, speculative surplus that goes beyond whatever is the case, beyond mere existence, and that any ossification of categories in permanence betrays the demand for a continual responsiveness to suffering. Breaking up categories is something Levinas is for. He calls it the reduction or the resaying, but it is different than the disruptive face-to-face relationship. Number 7. This leads me to the question, what conception of time is used in Martin's philosophy of Judaism? It seems to me, despite its provenance in Levinas's idea of Judaism as anachrony, that it's from Benjamin's idea of history as discontinuous, which Martin analyzes in detail. According to it, he says, any construction of history leaves out something, and the things left out happen, so, quote, possess a nucleus of time in themselves, end quote, meaning they do not derive their determinacy from a context. It is from Benjamin's idea of discontinuous history that Martin derives the idea of moral outrage taking us out of time. It decodes and takes us out of the crystallized time discussed by Benjamin. Moral outrage does not take us out of time to the Levinasian infinite on this Benjaminian account, but out of our present circumstance to other arrangements that should be considered part of the Levinasian indefinite, the indefinite different ways in which our world right now could be maintained and allowed to thrive. Another way of putting my point is that Benjaminian decoding is closer to Levinasian reductionary saying than to Levinasian anachrony. Number 8. Finally, I want to point out the use of phenomenology, specifically the Heideggerian form of it, in Martin's working out of a philosophy of Judaism. Phenomenology, as Heidegger points out, is about how beings come to light, about how beings show themselves from themselves in their interrelatedness with other beings. Levinas, for one, constantly critiques light. Vision is not a transcendence, he says. Light does not enable one to approach objects face to face. In other words, seeing things as they are and as they show themselves from themselves to us over time does not take us out of the world. Martin could reply, of course, that he wants and makes room for both the phenomenology and something beyond that phenomenology. And I have to say, I have some sympathy for that approach. At the same time, I wonder if combining the two is enough, or whether there is need for some kind of what I'm calling casually here today, a phenomenology of the other that in a certain way takes account of singularity. That is what Levinas does in Totality and Infinity by beginning not with tool use, but with hunger and enjoyment. with the contentment or being given content itself that makes us up in the first place and throughout our lives, an phenomenology of the very existence of the singular other. It takes account of the singular other by beginning with the process of being given content, contentment or contentment, whatever that content is, since it is through that process that we exist through our lives. For Levinas, the account of this being contented is the start of the development that eventually leads to the more complex interrelational concept of language, teaching, the ethical, and so forth that makes up his work. I am of two minds about whether combining phenomenology and something that takes us out of the world is enough, or whether we need a phenomenology or an phenomenology that itself takes us out of the world. And I'm eager for Martin's thoughts. Conclusion. I've attempted in this comment to engage in a phenomenological process of putting Martin Shuster's new book in interrelation with the thought of various other thinkers, with the goal of the juxtaposition being to bring aspects of Martin's work to light. I hope the process also highlights the importance and significance of Martin's work. And I hope that looking beyond the horizon of his book looking beyond the horizon his book establishes, reorients us by showing new lines of connection, some questions, and some possible lines of critique. Thank you.
Okay, silent clapping all around, please. Okay, so we will now have Martin respond to the responses, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So Martin.
Great, thanks, Dustin, and thank you, Allison, for all the tech stuff, and thank you, all three of you, for these really rich responses. Like Dustin said, this book sort of came out during the pandemic, and I've never released a book during a pandemic. It's a very odd experience. You know, releasing an academic book is pretty odd as is, because it's sort of, somebody once said that writing a poem in America is like throwing a feather in the Grand Canyon. And I think writing academic books sometimes feels a little bit like that too. And so I'm very grateful for all of these sort of rich engagements, especially from people who, you know, one way or another I've been reading or talking to for many years. I'm very grateful, so thank you. I'm in the process of moving, so I have to be honest and say that even though Annabel and Deborah were kind enough to send me their remarks ahead, I didn't have a great deal of time to prepare. So I'm sort of like Mike, reading off of notes. But I was struck by how many sort of interrelated questions there are. And so I'm sort of going to go in reverse order, actually, because I think, Deborah, you sort of raised somehow some of the biggest questions that if I can begin to try to address, then they will naturally take us to some of the questions that Annabel and Mike raised. And I think, you know, just sort of going in order, I'll start with a few of the specific points that you raised, Deborah, to move to the bigger questions about phenomenology, which to me are somehow key here, I think. And so just the question of Derrida, it's sort of a large question. I think the question of which figures to involve, Annabel, you sort of raised this also implicitly by highlighting Camus. And since writing this book, I think there's actually other figures that I think I would have liked to involve in one way or another. But, you know, I feel like this is something that just sort of happens. Whenever you write, you naturally gravitate to certain figures. But I think the bigger question that you sort of raised, Deborah, about the question of home, I think is instructive for thinking about some of the questions that you raised about the different levels of analysis, and that I think are also involved in Mike's remarks. So, and I think we need to think about the sort of register of analysis that's at work here. And so, in a way, you're sort of putting Derrida and Adorno into dialogue on this question, at least implicitly. And I think there's a certain conceptual analysis that's happening in Derrida, purely at the conceptual level, where you sort of you have this you have the demonstration that certain terms cannot be thought without other terms, and so forth. And I think in Adorno, there's something like a material analysis where it becomes impossible to think certain terms because of the material conditions that are currently occurring. or have occurred. And how these overlap and relate to each other, I think, is not exactly a small or easy question. And I think that's something that I would sort of bracket at the moment that we can discuss more after I say a few more things. The question of sort of marvelment that you raise, marvelment that you raise in Levinas, I think is also interesting, but it also, I think, somehow raises this question of at least two different levels of analysis. I think on one hand, there's something like ontological difference, which is where I try to pitch the reading of Maimonides. So it's meant exactly to overlap with some of Levinas's possibilities in the essays from the 30s, especially the Maimonides essay. But on the other hand, I think there's the question of how we arrive at this insight around ontological difference. That is by drawing more and more connections about the world and recognizing what doesn't appear there. And that, I think, is a procedure that you find in Maimonides that you don't necessarily find in Levinas. So Levinas arrives at it by other means. I find Strauss sort of less useful here because I think really the distinctions there are somehow different, because really he's very keen on saying that for Judaism, for Jerusalem, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So this modality of fear, I think, introduces something a little bit different. But I think all of this in a way raises really stellar questions. So the questions about infinity that you sort of introduced from this, and phenomenology. And it makes me realize that I could have spent more time here to make things a little bit clearer in the book. So I think, Deborah, you're right that it's really a question of phenomenology. But I do think that there aren't two options that are differentiated or unrelated. Rather, they're intimately connected. And the way I would frame this is everything sort of revolves around somehow intentionality in the Husserlian sense. So in Otherwise Than Being, for example, Levinas is very clear that there's a sort of phenomenological innovation where Husserl emphasized lawful lived experience that has a certain continuity of time consciousness. I think Levinas proposes a discontinuity. So we carry inside us things that cannot properly be ourselves, or there's a certain discontinuity. This to me doesn't seem disconnected from the sort of analyses that I think Benjamin and Adorno offer. They are just ways in which we may discover that sort of discontinuity is exactly by means of some of these analyses. But I think everything then hinges on the sort of temporality that's involved here, especially with regard to the actual philosophical procedures themselves. And again, I think it's a question of phenomenology and a question of intentional consciousness as a sort of keystone for thinking about that. What I think unites Heidegger and Levinas, and where I think, Deborah, I'd want to push back on sort of saying that this is a phenomenology, whereas in Heidegger you get phenomenology. I think there's actually more overlap between all of them, is a concern with intentionality of objects that just don't appear. So in this sense, there's a lot of overlap between the Heideggerian analysis and the Levinasian analysis. And I think, to use a phrase that Mike invoked on my behalf, at a high altitude sort of view, I think this unites a lot of thinkers from Heidegger to Levinas down to the contemporary moment in someone like Claudio Romano. And that, I think, is a much longer sort of discussion about phenomenology and about the procedures of phenomenology and about the sort of distinctions between these different phenomenological projects, which I view all as a sort of radicalization of Husserl. And I saw Bettina's in the audience, so I know also that there are many Husserls, especially in the archives, that Bettina is especially well aware of. So perhaps radicalization is also saying too much, because there are obviously elements in Husserl that were already radicalizing his own project at a certain point. So let me put that sort of out there, and then now turn to some of Mike's and Annabelle's questions. And Mike concludes with this question of normativity. And it's a tough question because I think also there's a lot of different normative questions that are in play in the book in many ways. And I was trying to sort of figure out which one is sort of catching Mike's eye the most, because my sense somehow, if you frame this as a project of phenomenology in the way that I've just been suggesting, then I don't mean to suggest that, this is the only way to do phenomenology. I think this doesn't somehow supersede other methods. It's just a particular way of approaching a phenomenological analysis. And in that sense, then the question of normativity somehow, as far as I can tell, really becomes, well, why do philosophy at all? Because I think every other sort of normative question is already somehow after the fact of this phenomenological analysis. And as I try to stress in the book, there are so many different ways of satisfying it. So, the question of the relation to the other, as I argue throughout, can be satisfied as much in some sort of, what we would typically call an ethical approach of caring for the other as of murdering the other. Both of those are properly, normative responses. And so I would want to, I guess, hear a little bit more about which questions of normativity we're most sort of curious about, because my sense somehow is there is just the normative question of why we philosophize at all. And that to me is, and I can see you're shaking your head, no, that's not the question. So then I want to have a longer discussion about this, because my sense somehow is there are so many different ways to satisfy the various normative questions involved that I want to keep open. And then I think in a way this is also related to the question that you end with, Annabel, which I think we've all somehow thought about in one way or another. But I think what I would respond to with regard to that question is I would sort of make 2 points. I mean, one, so this question of why not start with sort of universal freedom? Why bother with Judaism altogether? I think I would have a 2-pronged response here. I mean, on one hand, I think there's lots of dangers with starting with universal abstract sort of specifications in various ways. And here we could marshal Levinas just as easily as Hegel. I'm thinking of the sort of absolute terror section of the Phenomenology. I'm not sure that gets us sort of what we need. So that would be a sort of negative argument from starting there. But I think the other argument I would quote sort of, I would quote you yourself, Annabel, of sort of when you talk about the abstracted eternity of the Jewish message and the concreteness of specific persons need each other. I mean, we somehow don't have a choice given where we start with. And so there's just a sort of practical dimension to all of this that seems to me inescapable. And there would be something, I think, both dangerous and probably also incredibly self-defeating about trying to ignore or abandon or fail to acknowledge that in some way. Now, I think that, that doesn't settle everything, because that in a way just throws the question back. I think in a way what you're asking is almost 2 separate questions, which is why do we need particular traditions of Judaism and why do we need tradition altogether? And I think I've sort of answered the latter. And then you might say, oh, well, what about the former? Why this particular tradition? And here I think I would just say it's where we start. And I think that, as Deborah sort of wonderfully shows, I think that you can find these elements within the Jewish tradition itself. So you don't have to necessarily use these very, late European thinkers, Maimonides excluded, but you could also use traditional Jewish sources to come at the same sorts of questions. And that's sort of what I was saying in the beginning, that if I were writing this now, I think I would make it a much longer book that might involve some more of these elements. But that I think that always happens whenever you write something, is you have different ways of possibly doing it. But I think that would be the sketch of my answer. But with all of these things, I would love to discuss them more and hear what all of you think, and also to hear from the audience. But thank you all. And thank you, Dustin.
Michael, you want to respond to? Okay, so everyone's very eager. Okay, so Michael, Annabel, and then we'll open it up to the general population.
Martin?
Actually, why don't, sorry, I'm
yeah.
going to redo this, seeing as Deborah lifted her hand too. Why don't the 3 of you quickly say whatever you want to say, and then Martin can respond to you all at once rather than go back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. sorry, Michael.
Yeah, Martin, I want to bring to your attention Annabelle's comment about the distinctiveness of the work. And she commented specifically at one point about how you take the Levinasian account of anachronism, which is against the background of concerns about justice, right? And you shift it to freedom, which I mean, we all noticed that you did that. And the implication is that it underscores what Annabelle pointed out, that this isn't a book about Adorno. It's not a book about Levinas. It's not a book about any one of the figures. It's that you're taking readings of these figures that are very perspectival and limited, and you're patching them together as part of an overall program, right? That's in a sense what I was trying to articulate, what the overall program was. And the question that I'd like to ask you is, if you see it that way, then you have a lot of leeway, don't you, about your readings of the various figures. In other words, you don't have to take something from those figures that is not part of the reason that you're employing them. In other words, this isn't a book in intellectual history. It's not a book in the history of philosophy. It's a creative book to shape a philosophical account of the human condition around Jewishly vectored or, sources. And wasn't that what was behind your mind, in the back of your mind? And my question about the normativity wasn't the normativity of the approach. It's the fact that the practical engagement with the world and others that you articulate in terms of the work on Maimonides and Adorno, right? That practical responsiveness is normative. What stands behind the normativity? There's a normative force. There's a force behind the oughtness of it, so to speak. And in the Western tradition, there's a kind of Kantian approach from a rational ground. There's a Humean approach from the point of view of desires and preferences, let's say. There's a social approach, right? That it's basically social convention, or there's divine command theory or something like that. Where does it come from? You point toward a transcendence that beyond at certain points. Is that what you're alluding to? Or no, you don't want to bring that into the picture at all? I'll stop there.
Well, I'll just riff a little off of what Michael just said. I had the sense that when you got to what was beyond, that you kind of finessed what it was. And that might be the normative ground. Was it God? Was it the other as other, the absolute other? So I think, along with Michael, I think that might be something for you to think about in the future.
Sorry. I think that Michael said more or less everything I could have wanted to say. So I don't have much to add, but Martin, I just want to push you again on my question of why Judaism, because I agree with everything and I totally accept your answer. Still, I think that there's a question of why do we need specifically Judaism here? And except for the fact that you took Levinas and that Levinas said Judaism is an anachronism and and you used the concept of anachronism, but I'm not sure that let's put it in a very, very simple way. Judaism is something that doesn't really appear in the book, or there's something in Judaism that really doesn't really appear in the book. And so what I'm asking here, is not exactly about the need for concrete traditions, but why do you wrote this subtitle, A Philosophy of Judaism? Why did you need that in that book? Why couldn't you just call the book How to Measure a World? Why did you need this A Philosophy of Judaism?
Great. All right. Well, thank you all. So let me, this is great because it actually reminded me that there are a few things that I wanted to say that I forgot. So Mike, I'll start with your sort of question. So I think broadly speaking, I mean, if you want me to sort of situate the normative stance, I think it's something like what you find in Cavell and Wittgenstein. So in other words, what's normative here is the form of life into which we're initiated, and then we can take a particular stance to that form of life. And there are a variety of ways in which we might do that, and there are particular analyses that I think that you can do of our capacities as language users that are involved in that I think overlap in productive ways with phenomenological analyses. But there's nothing, I think, beyond that in the sense of normativity. Now, that form of life also consistently points beyond itself. And I think that's the register that I've tried to capture in this book in various ways. And that is one of the features of being a language user, is both having this unavoidable capacity and also being in the world in such a way that the world itself also perpetually raises these as problems, just in the sense that we exist among other people, as you noted, intersubjectively. And so I think that the normativity, as you highlight, is a sort of practical normativity. And in that sense, I think it's different from a lot of the models that you note in the history of philosophy. And I think, there's a lot more to say there, but I think you can't easily reduce it to any of those models. And I think then you're going to sort of say, oh, well, it sort of sounds potentially like Hume or like Kant. And I think, like, yes, it does, but I think there's probably a lot more that we could say where it's not just Kant, it's not Kant where you're just sort of ruled by abstract principles that universal reason proposes somehow, but it's also not just Hume where you're ruled by emotions, because those emotions are also somehow embedded in reason. And here I would have to, I think, point to other things that I've written. So maybe the Adorno book, I mean, talks about this in much more depth, but I think that's roughly the sort of trajectory of how I would respond here. I think in a way, I hope that this begins to point to how I would also respond to Deborah and this question of the beyond. I think, again, maybe this won't be satisfying, but I suspect that everybody fudges it when they talk about the beyond. I mean, how else could you do it in a way? I mean, all we can do is we can diagnose sort of elements that point to it. But once we begin speaking about it in some sort of ontological way, then I think we're probably doing something else apart from phenomenology or philosophy, or at least that would be what I would want to say. And then the question of Judaism, I guess, Annabel, everything hinges here on this invocation of need, because when you ask sort of why do we need Judaism, I don't know, like need practically, need philosophically, need conceptually. I'm not sure. We certainly don't need it, I think, conceptually, probably. We probably don't need it philosophically. But I would say we, and here I mean a very concrete we, need it practically, just in the sense that it's where we begin. And in that sense, I think, Mike, you're absolutely right, and Annabel and all of you. I mean, this is an odd sort of book. Admittedly, it's something I would have never thought that I would write a book like this if you had told me, after my first Adorno book, that I would write something like this. Because it's not, I almost think of it in my mind as something between theology and philosophy in some way, because it's a very autobiographical book in that sense. And so why do I feel like I need Judaism here? Because I feel like something like this perspective is left out of contemporary invocations of Judaism oftentimes. And so that's the necessity, but that's not a philosophical or conceptual sort of a necessity. That's an autobiographical necessity. But I think in a way this harkens back to my response to Mike, which is, I think I'd like to say that there's a certain linguistic program that underwrites all of this. And I think there's nothing wrong with importing sort of autobiography and the human voice into philosophy in this way. And here Obviously, the sort of touchstone for me is someone like Cavell, but I think Cavell's not alone in that regard. And I think so that would be the parameters of how I try to respond to all of this.
That was more thoughtful than we deserve, perhaps. Does anyone want to ask a question from the general audience? You can unmute yourself and show your face if you want. I know everyone is weird on these things. Anyone? I mean, I'm going to just ask weird and awkward questions if somebody doesn't step in.
It's like teaching our undergrads.
No, it's slightly worse. Okay, so I'm going to then use my prog.
Bettina raised her hand.
Oh, see, I don't see these somehow. Oh, there we are. Hi, Bettina. Can you unmute yourself?
I'm doing so. I am doing.
Perfect.
Could you put your camera on by any chance?
I am doing both. Having a little trouble getting the video. My host has stopped it. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Dustin?
Tina, I changed the setting, so just try again there.
Okay, suddenly I'm at church.
Great.
Great.
Bettina, it's nice to see you.
It's nice to see you too. And thank you to everybody for this really exciting and difficult discussion. I just wanted to throw out some things by way of sort of possible paths. Since nobody else, since I want to be a good undergraduate. In light of the force behind the oughtness, which was something that Michael, of course, brought up, and which form of life I think responds very beautifully to, as Martin said. There's also in a phenomenological tradition that gives up scientific identity, right? I.e., Heidegger, but also Merleau-Ponty, the very fact of embodiment in the world, without any question of whether there's a transcendence of that world or there are limits or parameters of that world. The Merleau-Pontian idea would be to situate normativity in an embodiment in the world, which I think could mesh with a Wittgensteinian form of life, with some argument. Another question was with regard to Annabel's brilliant and highly disturbing intervention, and I have read her book and admired it. It reminds me of Una Eisenstadt. Why Camus when one has someone like Yeshayahu Leibovitz? For example, I mean, Leibovitz, largely left-leaning, who insisted on the separation of church and state, all these things that you all already know. But when asked why he practiced the mitzvot, why he followed the law, given his other convictions, right? His answer was via the absurd.
Was what?
It was via the absurd. I do this because, as it is absurd. I am a Jew, it is perhaps absurd, and yet I do it anyway. And so I wanted to throw that out because perhaps with or even beyond Camus, there is an absurd that allows us to respond to a normativity whose sources are probably fleeting or hard to situate other than through forms of life and being in the world, being embodied in the world. Finally, and just tell me to shut up if I'm talking too much. I really, really do believe, as Claude Lefort would say that about democracy, that this is in response to you, Deborah. There are some things, some spaces that need to be left open. In other words, for Lefort, the definition of democracy itself was that there was a case vide, sorry for the French, that there was just an empty site that had to be left open for the movement of freedom and sovereignty to take place. In other words, in terms of transcendence, further should probably not be proposed than that. Do I make myself understandable, or am I unclear?
Thank you, Bettina. No, I think it's clear. I very much agree about the stress on embodiment. I think that's sort of what I was hearkening to by invoking my earlier work in Adorno, where I think you can find a similar idea in Adorno, and I try to argue that with the moral addendum. I mean, it's really a bodily addendum, and I think there are connections to Merleau-Ponty. And the Leibowitz point, I think, is very interesting. I mean, yeah, I need to think about it a little more. I mean, he also talks about he binds himself to the yoke of the law. Yeah, right. Yeah, no, thank you.
Bill, I'm assuming you've become visible because you have something to say. No, seriously, you're just saying hi. You're not going to ask anything. All right, I'm going to ask. So we've been.
There's a hand up there.
Why do I never see this?
Jacqueline's hand is up.
Yes.
Hey, Dustin.
Well, hey, how are you?
Good. I'd like to ask a question, sort of pulling a bit on Annabelle's question. It pulled me personally a lot, and I have a slightly different relationship to the we that you used in your answer, Martin, about we Jews, because I'm a Jew by choice. And I mean, you don't want to hear the long story of why, but the short answer is choosing the philosophy, and the ritual and a whole bunch of other stuff, but more than anything, choosing the philosophy. And it seems to me you need to answer the question of what's lost if a specific Judaism specifically is lost, because there would still be other traditions, and if you weren't Jewish, you'd be something else. But would something specific and unique be lost, if not for Judaism, philosophically? And it seems to me there would. Not that it's the only or the best, but it's a really important something. And you seemed, and your choices of sources seem to reinforce that to me. But do you really not believe that there's something specific there?
Well, I guess, and this is a thank you. It reminds me of something else that I want to say in response to Annabelle, but I think it'll work to respond to sort of both of you in a way. I do think something would be lost, but it would be this anachronistic sort of tradition that I think is the most important thing. And the reason I say that is because I think when you say sort of why do we need Judaism, I mean, we're already presupposing that we have some sense of what that exactly means. And it's an open question, right? Because whatever you try to marshal as sort of the essence of Judaism, with the exclusion, I think, of something like anachronism, at least I'd want to suggest that. Perhaps people would dispute that. But whatever you marshal, A, I think you will find in other traditions. And B, I think you will also find normative traditions of Judaism that push against that. In other words, this is just a very basic Adornian point that you also find in Sholem, and that the two correspond around this point in a way is, I mean, every tradition leaves something out and puts something in. And that's true of any stream of Judaism in a way. So, I mean, just think about Sholem's sort of conception of what the motor of, quote, Jewish history or Judaism is in comparison to other thinkers and so forth. And then we can, if we are starting with a position that, the sort of roughly orthodox view is the view of Judaism, then yeah, I don't know what to say to that. But, if we're willing to really mine the archive that is Jewish sort of textual source material, then I think it is so vast, as even sort of modern orthodoxy shows. I mean, you have people who, whose worship looks very similar to Christianity. I'm thinking of certain sects of Lubavitchers, for example. I mean, so I think the archive is vast enough to admit of so many different positions. And that's why I think if you can try to tease out some formal quality that's involved here, and this is the sort of question of anachronism.
I think you specifically don't have to do that. And I mean, not only are there so many different Judaisms over several thousand years worth of history and global movements and, you know, layers of movements, you don't have to respond to the question with an essentialist answer. I mean, to take a non-Jewish source, there's, you know, kind of Wittgensteinian family resemblances. But even within Jewish textual sources, I mean, to look at like a page of Talmud, I mean, plurality and not having things neatly tied up is a really important part of the story, or stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. But then I'm not sure what the force of the question of why do we need Judaism? I mean, we all start somewhere, right? Autobiographically. And so in that sense, I think, you know, you start where you are, and that's not some sort of force that has no input from human sort of intervention, in the sense that one can choose what sources one finds compelling as well. And so, I mean, then I think, Mike, you're absolutely right to highlight that, yeah, that there's something distinct going on in sort of what I'm doing, and there is an element of human freedom, if we can talk about that. I don't think it's entirely foreign to Levinas's account either, especially in Totality and Infinity. I think once you move into later works, he moves further and further away from being in any way really concerned with that seriously. But yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Am I missing another hand?
Well, Deborah has a hand, but it's not a virtual hand. It's
I only answered to virtual hands at this point. I don't even see flesh. I'm actually going to, if you don't mind, jump in with a question first, because is Judah, the talks that you have, the questions you have to have at any Jewish philosophy talk being like, how is this Jewish, and do we need Judaism for this to work, have been done. So I'm going to like put those to the side for a moment. I have two equally irritating questions. One is, why time, not space? You know, why can't I be out of sync spatially and sort of arrive at the same things? And also, what, and maybe you answered this in the book, and in my flurry to finish it, I didn't see it, but is there any way of differentiating what we might want to call some sort of good anachronism from, say, a bad anachronism? Like, you know, being subspecies eternitatis seems, based on your account, to be bad because it's so out of time, it almost doesn't link back to it ethically. Can we differentiate between different types of anachronism? And by we, I mean you. I'm not doing any work here.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to answer the second question. So I'll try to answer the first, and maybe while I'm talking, find some way to answer the second. But so why time and not space? I mean, I don't remember where, because I don't have the book in front of me. I don't know where it is at the moment. But I think I addressed this in a footnote somewhere, where in a way, you know, it's a book about time, but it becomes a book about space because it's about worldhood in many ways. And so I'm not sure that we can so easily draw the distinction between the two. And in that sense, probably there's some longer discussion that we can have about both temporality and spatiality. And but so that would be the answer there, I think. I don't know. I find it difficult to parse things using these sort of terms of good and bad. I mean, I don't know what to do with that, Dustin. Exactly.
Yeah, sorry, I understand it's annoying. It's just, I guess if you view it as the sort of opening to any kind of, you know, Judaic informed normativity, you need this sort of disjunction, right? And so to a certain extent, as I think has been mentioned, anachronism is doing the work that transcendence did in a lot of like earlier 20th century Jewish philosophy here, right? Like it's giving you that sort of necessary gap in which to start doing ethics. But unlike transcendence, it's much easier, I think, for us right now to wrap our head around some notion of anachronism than transcendence, right? And it doesn't require these sorts of inside-outside models. But I guess it was because I was, and please don't be offended by this, because I really quite like him. But when I was reading it, like some of comparisons to Sloterdijk kept popping up in my head. So the Spheres project. I understand most people don't like Sloterdijk, but I'm quite fond of him. And it struck me in some respects you're using time to build spheres here, and you know, but they don't completely align, right? Which seems to be, I think, if I understand correctly, why you use Plato and Aristotle as a sort of other model of asynchrony that you don't like as much, right? Or
yeah, I guess I would be tempted to put it a little bit differently. And here's what I'm going to say, and I'd love to hear what you sort of think about this. And I think in a way now I see that your questions are actually sort of related. So
yeah, it's all the same question.
look, I think of the analogy here as something like Kant's third critique. I'm only using it as an analogy in the sense that the whole process of reflective judgment is not something that happens just by means of me making some sort of conscious decision. Rather, something about the world provokes it. So, and that's central to Kant's argument, is that the world itself is what provokes it and invites these sort of reflective judgments. And I would say something analogous here. It's the world itself that presents these sort of anachronistic possibilities. And so, I think there are ways in which, you could be anachronistic, just sort of initiating that just completely on the subject side without any sort of concern or care for the object in question. And I think that would just be a different way of doing it that I do also think you find in the history of philosophy. And in a way, I think by trying not to do that, I think maybe these questions of transcendence and immanence, then I think were somehow at the very least changed or pursued quite differently. So much so that I think it strikes me as not exactly apt to maybe compare them, because I think really it's the world itself that I think is inviting this, or at least I'd want to argue that. And that I think goes back to this sort of bit about embodiment, this bit about forms of life, and all of that in a certain way.
No, I think what struck me as strongest about your book, what I really quite appreciated, is that it's not intersubjectivity besotted or like about my relationship. It's a function of the world itself that is very like it's a much stronger claim than a lot of Jewish philosophy seems willing to make, which I really appreciated. Okay, so let's end with two more questions and then we'll finish. So one from Deborah, one from Michael. We'll ask them both and then we respond, and that will be it.
I wanted to go back to my question about Derrida. So if we start with, in my talk anyway, the Midrashim, one saying it's good to be in a home, and the other saying that when we get settled in a place, that's when the trouble starts. So if we could say this is at least one conception of a Judaism, or at least a little fragment of a Judaism, then the question is how you relate those two. And I think your emphasis is on being out of place. But I think Derrida would say the two are much more inextricably combined. And not just Derrida, also Levinas. I mean, for Levinas, you have a home that's open to the outside. And there's a necessity for a home. And so if we're kind of thinking of our commitments to people, it seems to me we have to have both, and an emphasis on both, on home and being outside the home, or else, to go into some kind of movement kind of language, political movement talk, or else our movements are overly idealistic. They discuss the idea of rupture on behalf of something in the future, which will then have to be ruptured on behalf of the future, without the other side of a movement. I'm kind of a left-wing movement person, being, kind of establishing a structure, that there is no openness without some closedness, in other words. And I wonder if the question of how you intertwine the being in the world and being outside the world how do you intertwine them? I think that's a big question to think about. I don't know if what I said was as clear as I would like, but
no, I think it was quite clear, and I actually tend to agree with you. I mean, about that point, I'm not sure about the broader point about how to integrate Derrida. It seems to me that there's so much more that's involved in just this question. But on this question, I actually very much agree. And again, I would stress that you're probably right that rhetorically I prioritize the anachronistic elements, but I think and again, perhaps it just wasn't clear enough both in the book and also in my response, but I think I very much agree that yes, you need to have a home, and I buy the sort of Levinasian sort of arguments of totality and affinity, and to me those are just an extension of us being embodied creatures, which is part of our embodiment is the necessity of having a home to which one can retreat and have these sort of economic relations that he talks about and so forth. And I think what I tried to sort of stress in my original response, sort of invoking Adorno, is just that there are different levels of analysis. So, I think Levinas is really concerned with a certain analysis of embodiment, and it's done in a sort of pre-philosophical register, like whatever that might mean phenomenologically. Whereas I think Adorno, when he starts analyzing the home and invoking this idea of not feeling at home, I mean, he's already talking about concrete material reality. So the level of analysis is just a little bit different. I mean, he just says, look, like, you have these modern homes, and for you to have a home, basically a whole bunch of other people have to suffer just to procure the materials for your home and whatever else. And that, I think, is also seems right somehow. Does that undermine the phenomenological analysis? I don't think so. I think it just casts it in a slightly different register then, I think. But it's not unrelated. And I think that whole question is not unrelated to the question of Derrida, where there are so many different levels of analyses that are involved at different stages. But I think broadly speaking, I think there are probably lots of profitable connections that one could draw here, especially with autoimmunity. I mean, you could, I think, make some interesting moves and involve that in questions of anachronism, but it's just stuff that I haven't pursued, but I think it's worthwhile probably to do so.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for showing up. I want to thank our lovely panelists. I'd like to thank Martin, and especially I would like to thank Allison in the background, who is pulling all of the gears and doing all of the inviting work and whatnot. And yeah, a round of, again, silent alienated applause, please.
And thank you, Dustin, for organizing, and thank you again to the respondents. It's really lovely to have something like this in the midst of basically pretty terrible packing and moving and whatever else.
All right, take care, everyone.
Take care. Thank you all.